Welcome to Drewry's Freight Loop on Airfreight. I would like to welcome my colleague Tom Crabtree, leading Airfreight analyst based in Seattle. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you for having me, Philip.
So, Tom, you're going to give us the key insights into what's happening to the airfreight cargo market. To start with, 2024 was a good year for airfreight traffic growth. What trends in growth have you seen this year in the context of tariff changes in the US?
Well, the growth patterns in air freight traffic worldwide have been very erratic throughout 2025, whereas compared to year 2024, which was a very strong growth year for air freight, with air freight grew like 11.4% for the full year over year 2023 levels, driven mainly by air exports of e-commerce shipments out of China, as well as the diversion of quite a bit of container ship traffic through South Asia and Middle East ports due to the shutdown of Red Sea traffic and Suez transit traffic. But that effect is now starting to abate. But so far this year, growth has been about not quite 3% for the first 6 months of 2025 over the same period in 24. And not surprisingly, the biggest market, region-to-region flow market, that is Far East to and from North America, has seen some very erratic patterns, as one might imagine, with the trade pronouncements from the U.S. government starting in January of this year.
Okay, so looking at this huge Far East North America air cargo market, what do the latest traffic volume numbers show?
Well, with the implementation of a number of rules from the U.S. government in early May of this year, air freight traffic on the Trans-Pacific market fell nearly 11% in the month of May relative to the month of May 2024. What's interesting is that a lot of number of other air freight lanes like Far East to and from Europe have picked up that slack. They're now growing double digits. Intra-Far East has accelerated. But more recently, when the June statistics for IATA became available, we noticed that the fall in Trans-Pacific traffic basically halved. Instead of 11% down in May, it was only a little less than 5% down in June relative to June 2024. So, in a word, it appears shippers and trade experts are adjusting to the uncertainty.
See, and the traffic growth numbers you mentioned in June, I believe we're just waiting for final July numbers, were much higher on some non-US routes than lackluster growth on US routes. What does this tell us?
I think that, for example, Chinese exporters are basically refocusing a lot of their trade towards those partners that are a little more reliable than the United States, particularly in Europe and intra-Far East trading partners. Beneficiaries that we've noticed to date are countries like Vietnam have witnessed a very big air export boom, as well as a container ship boom, I might add, in 2025. So India's picked up the slack to a lesser degree. So we're seeing quite a bit of adjustment there. What is interesting, just as an aside, is that the Middle East Europe air trade lane was the fastest growing trade lane in 2024, simply because of the sea air diversion traffic we witnessed that I mentioned earlier. Every month of this year, though, that market has contracted, and I think in my conversations with aircraft operators as well as freight forwarders, basically shippers are adjusting and to longer supply chain flows and moving their a good part of their flows back to container shipping simply because it's more affordable.
And you're obviously tracking all these trends in the Drewry Air Freight Insight. One factor that we haven't discussed so far is air freight rates. What factors are driving air freight rates down these days?
Well, fuel prices, for one, have come down fairly consistently this year. There's been a bit of variation by market, but not a lot in general. So fuel surcharges in relation should also face some downward pressure. More to the point, one has to keep in mind that rates were elevated with those two boom factors I mentioned earlier. That is e-commerce exports, particularly out of China, as well as the sea air diversion. Those pressures have abated in 2025. Compared to what we're tracking at Drewry in terms of ocean rates, which have been extremely volatile, especially over the last, I would say, 3 to 6 months, where there was a big boom in rates per 40-foot box back in May. Those numbers have now since come back down to much lower numbers. We haven't seen that in air freight, which I find very curious. Air freight rates are down, but in aggregate, not that much on a world average. Now, specific markets, absolutely, like ex-China to and from the United States, or ex-China to the United States, those rates have come down, and substantially, I might add, as well, over the course of 2025. And I think, again, that is shippers basically trying to reorient their traffic to trade lanes, which are a little more reliable. So more exports to Europe, more exports to the Middle East. I would not be terribly surprised if there are diversionary traffic routings. Even the transatlantic market, which has not been a very dynamic market for most of the last 20 years, has seen fairly strong growth. That is mostly ex-European air exports to North America. In fact, growth on that trade lane was nearly 11% in March and has been fairly strong all year long.
And how about passenger belly and freighter capacity? Have they pushed rates down?
To a degree, the interesting thing is that we are now more than, I would say, 2 to 3 years beyond the COVID recovery period beginning. What we still have are a number of major airspace closures, particularly the Russian Federation, which makes it very difficult for U.S. Aircraft operators. They are not allowed to transit Russian airspace because of the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict and the Western stance towards Russia. Chinese air-based airlines, however, can transit. And what's interesting is the belly capacity on the Trans-Pacific market between East Asia and North America relative to the first 6 months of this year is still down roughly 15% compared to its levels back in the first 6 months of 2019, the last full calendar year before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that has to do with the fact that Chinese airlines have not been allowed to restore their full passenger networks to and from North America, and quid pro quo, neither are the US or Canadian-based carriers allowed to do the same to China.
So to conclude, what would be, based on your analysis, the 4 key points from Drewry's Air Freight Insight for people to remember?
Well, watch for opportunities in, I would say, slower markets that are not directly connected to the United States. That's where you'll probably find more ample capacity, at least that's what we've noticed up until, I would say, mid-August 2025. I would say that the relative pricing differential for many of the clients of Drewry it basically is probably going in the direction that as ocean rates come down, air freight rates more or less don't come down as much. The relative value proposition for air freight probably isn't as good. On the flip side, in terms of schedule reliability, air freight is much more reliable. And I would argue that most people think of air freight as a speed and recovery tool, but it's actually a reliability tool for many shippers. On a relative note, I noticed on some other Freight Loop broadcasts and some logistics executives briefings from Drewry that, for example, the Gemini Alliance is done a really good job of bolstering their on-time reliability. So that in itself warrants that, I would say, the relative value proposition from air is probably not as good as it was when container shipping on dock reliability rates were not as good. But I'll advise Drewry shippers that right now container shipping probably is a better value than it's been for a long time relative to air, simply because container ship rates have come down, air freight rates have come down, but not nearly as much. They've not been nearly as volatile. So in my opinion, container ship service in the latter half of 2025 is probably a better value than it's been for several years.
Great. Tom, well, thank you for sharing your valuable insights with Drewry followers and listeners. And see you, everybody, at the next Freight Loop.